Benedicite.
Benedicite. This is
This
Father
is-
Enoch.
Hi, Father. My name is Deacon Joseph, and we're here for this week's the start of a new format for Orthodox Apologetics Live.
Did you just run in the door, Father?
Literally just ran in the door up 3 flights.
Okay.
Now we're changing the format, I think, to an hour schedule. So it's 4 days a week. We didn't do yesterday. It was a bit crazy yesterday. But are we still doing different themes for shows, or is it all just congealing?
It's probably all kind of congealing. We haven't really planned anything out for tonight, so this is going to be the first 1 hour show, I guess.
Okay, cool. Let's see. I know we have some questions.
All right.
I know Basil asked a few, so if we get started, that'd be good. What do we have? Let's see. Did Origen actually castrate himself?
Yeah, yes.
Pretty sure he did. Everyone.
Let me find. I think. Hold on. Is there? Well, apparently now there's a new article in Wikipedia called "The Alleged Castration of Origen."
Oh, jeez.
So now
they probably.
Yeah, you don't want to look at the Wikipedia page. You don't look at it. I'm going to look at the Google books. Let me see. Okay. It may have been Eusebius of Caesarea. I thought there was some sort of a trial over this.
Yeah. Yeah, my guess is that they're trying to soften that up because they don't want to possibly admit to
see, because they can, yeah. Okay, what's the second question?
Let's take a look at it. Yeah, let's just go to the second question. To what extent is God incorporeal? Is the divine light incorporeal? Is God energetically corporeal since he can be seen in them? Are the angels incorporeal? I recall St. John Damascene saying only God truly is incorporeal.
Yeah, oftentimes angels will be called incorporeal, but the fathers teach that in comparison with God, only God is incorporeal. Because remember, God is totally other. You can't compare God's operations, let alone his essence, to anything that's in the created realm, in the sense of like matter and such, or anything created. So we just like we talk about the angels are spiritual beings, and God is called a spirit, but it doesn't mean that they're part of the same they're somehow in the same category. So now there was a discussion, I think, among some like the ignorant monks in the Egyptian desert in the late 4th century who believed God was anthropomorphic. By that, they don't mean the incarnation. I mean, there were some who actually believed God had hands and feet and eyes like God the Father, and that was condemned as a heresy in the 390s. So, but all right. So, what's the next question?
Let's see here. Next question. Here, I know we had some questions from last week. We're going to be playing catch up because there's lots of questions from different areas, so we will definitely get to them. I feel like number 3 and number 5 are related, which is matter a divine energia or divine energy?
Matter is not a divine energy.
Right. And that goes to number 5, which is what is the heresy of Yugoslavia or name worship? I find it rather perplexing that anyone we're doing, so I don't understand what it means. Is it related to Hegelianism? That's giving Yugoslavia way too much credit. I've seen the connection made through Bulgakov and his ilk. Yugoslavia is, of course, when it's boiled down to it, the belief that the name of God is itself God, and therefore God can be reduced to created matter, which leads to the question of matter being a divine energia. I've dealt with name worshippers personally. We actually all have at this point in my synod. But when I did,
doesn't it focus on a lot of the, at least the early name worshippers were teaching that the name Jesus is when you speak the name Jesus, you're actually God is manifesting himself.
Yeah.
Because the name Jesus they were calling the name Jesus even the essence of God.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. And
that's supposedly the primitive form. It was only later they began to think, well, let's call it the operations.
Right. They started saying that it was an energy of God. Then they started comparing it to an icon, which is where we get to the question, is matter a divine energy? And the answer is no.
Matter is created, a divine energy
created. Exactly. So matter can represent the divine energy. It is not the divine energy.
I mean, the name of God can be considered an icon. The name Jesus can be considered an icon, like a verbal icon, or
right.
But
a representation.
Exactly.
But it can be considered God himself. And this is ultimately what it comes right down to. This is the problem that name.
And a lot of the problems come from the fact that if you read some of the diary, My Life in Christ of St. John of Kronstadt, there are a number of statements he says that are kind of taken out of context. For example, he does say the name of God is God.
Yeah.
But then if you read the next lines, he says the name of the Theotokos is the Theotokos. The name of the saint is the saint. And what he was saying is that when you say the name, the holy name of God, or invoke the names of Our Lady or the saints, they're manifesting themselves there. It's not that you have control of God or that these verbal words or anything become or God himself. So, I mean, it's kind of a stupid heresy to begin with.
It is, but it started at just the right time where something so stupid can survive. Really, if that was if it was the age of Saint Basil and Saint John Chrysostom, and they would have torn that apart to pieces. But the idea that even Saint John of Damascus, even the Palamite discussions, the point is we came at a unique time where basically it didn't matter how smart you were, communists were going to shoot you. So effectively, it was just the perfect time for heretics to show up and say something dumb.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments on that, Father?
No. I think I covered it. I think I covered it with dumb.
Okay.
Let's see. 4. How did the Orthodox react to Protestantism? How did they react to the rise of textual criticism, theological liberalism, and the secularization of higher learning in Germany?
Well, first off, when we say textual criticism, we have to be very careful because there's a form of textual criticism which the church has always accepted, and that's simply comparing manuscript copies.
Right. Now, he says specifically when I say he says, how quickly was the Orthodox Church subverted in its seminaries? And then he said, when I say textual criticism, I mean speculation about the origin and authorship of texts outside their traditional attribution.
Okay. Well, that outside of their traditional attribution, I think that has all come into the so-called mainline Orthodox seminary system, I think, since the 1950s.
Yeah, I'd say that's accurate.
I think even because I think even like Saint was there even a Orthodox seminary in the United States before the 1950s to begin with? Jordanville, I think Jordanville was acting as a seminary in the 50s to the 40s, I believe. I don't think they were teaching that at Jordanville.
St. Tikhon's was founded as a pastoral school in 1938 and was turned into a seminary in 1942.
Yeah, and from my understanding, St. Tikhon's wasn't even teaching any of that biblical.
No. It wasn't even chartered by the Commonwealth until 1967. So
I think all this stuff came in once they started. Once a lot of with the Holy Cross people and the St. Vladimir Seminary stuff.
Yeah.
And then it begins to get into the Greek seminaries, the New Calendar Church Greek seminaries, probably in the 60s. Because remember, this is kind of, going back, there was a figure in the Greek theological, at least the New Calendar Greek theological world, called Paniotis Trimblos. Mm-hmm. And he was a conservative, a New Calendarist, but he was kind of like an old scholastic, old school type, he would have been analogous to the pre-revolutionary Russian type guys.
Yeah.
But he kind of opposed Romanides a lot. He did not like Romanides. In fact, he was the one that kept Romanides from getting a degree for a very long time because he said this guy is does not teach orthodoxy. He did not like him very much. But I think what happened is once I think he died in 1972 or something. But once that kind of school died away, people like Romanides and his followers kind of took power, or people that were influenced by him. And Romanides did not believe in the historicity of the Old Testament. You can read his writings and determine that right away. So he had no problem accepting most of this biblical criticism. Now, a lot of Maimonides devotees kind of ignore that, or they haven't really read all of his writings. They just read a few things, like how he talks about how, how Maimonides talks about how you have to check your spinal fluid, and your spinal fluid is it's insane things. Your spinal fluid is illumined, and and he's somehow he had he was, I don't know, anyway.
Yeah, I've read it. It's all really weird.
Exactly, but Maimonides was into all that stuff. I don't know. I'm not sure if Father Florovsky was into the biblical criticism. I do not recall. Someone might know more than I do.
Not as he never took it to that level.
Yeah, but I'd say in America it all started in the 50s and 60s with St. Vladimir's, and then the Holy Cross, and then it came into the Greek seminary system around the same time, and then in the Soviets, in the Soviets it was in the 50s and 60s too, in the Moscow Patriarchate.
Yeah.
Because there was like a former professor of Old Testament in Leningrad who, in fact, was teaching all this stuff. And then he famously apostatized, I guess, which is kind of interesting, apostatized again and became an atheist. Mm-hmm. And, but, you have people like Father Alexander Men, who was kind of one of these dissident liberal Moscow patriots, but he was teaching that stuff too. So, that was being taught in a lot of places. So, the question was, when did it come in? I'd say basically, probably officially in the 50s and 60s. That was when it started to come in. I'd venture to say that around the same time, it started to be that it kind of infected the Papist system. It kind of got into the Orthodox system as well. Because, at least in America, I think the Roman Catholic seminary system was kind of resistant to that up into the late 40s and 50s. At least from textbook-wise, but once they kind of gave in, there wasn't anything really holding a lot of it back. And then if you wanted to be in an accredited seminary, you kind of had to teach some of this stuff. You didn't really have to. But it made you. I think one of the problems that people at St. Vladimir's and others didn't want to go to some kind of intercollegiate seminar and be like kind of the weirdo obscurantist people, as they thought themselves to be. So, but anyway, what was that? What were the other connected questions to that point? I'm sorry, I went off on that tangent.
Well, they were, how did they react to the rise of textual criticism, theological liberalism?
In the 19th century in Russia, as I recall, you have like Elder Macarius of Optina. They kind of condemned this stuff. They thought, Saint Ignatius Brianchaninoff, Saint Theophan the Recluse. As I recall, and I know I'm kind of being vague and generalistic here, but I recall them all kind of just ridiculing this. I think Metropolitan St. Philibert of Moscow did the same. The concept that the Old Testament was a bunch of fables and the New Testament was kind of, kind of Jewish / Greek midrash. I don't think it was ever accepted anywhere in Orthodoxy until you had kind of into the 50s and 60s in any context.
Well, it would seem that Florovsky, based on what I'm reading here, I'm looking in his his works on the function of tradition in the ancient church. It's a Bible church tradition and Eastern Orthodox view, and basically, there's a chapter which we find in terms of the Bible and in terms of tradition, and he basically sees the church as the guardian of the meaning of the scriptures. In other words, he doesn't seem to appeal to outside interpretations outside of what the fathers say here. So basically, he was referring to, he talks about the double authority and double standards that Bales use it. One gets that you would get the impression. He points out you'd get the impression that scripture and tradition are the same thing, but in a sense, he sees scripture as basically subservient to the tradition of the church and to be understood by the tradition of the church, not necessarily subservient. But the point is, he doesn't seem to have a view of the scriptures as any way outside of the traditional interpretations that they were given.
But does that mean he accepts the historical narratives contained as accurate?
I was looking specifically for that. I did not find
some of this is gobbledygook language. I hate to say that, where they're not being too explicit. You have to ask specific questions like, do they believe Adam and Eve actually existed? Were they the first humans? Do they believe Noah actually built the ark? Do they believe, Abraham was real? That kind of stuff.
Well, I'm trying to see if I can find, something to that degree. Hold on. Just give me a second here. Because basically the only reference to Genesis in the entire 122 pages, he says there's one single and composite story from Genesis to Revelation, and the story's history. There's a process going on between those two terminal points, and this process has a definite direction. There's an ultimate goal, and ultimate consummation is expected. Every particular moment is correlated to both terms, and thereby has its proper and unique place within the whole. No moment, therefore, can be understood except in the context and perspective. Let me see. I'm trying to see if there's. I don't think it was.
Maybe, that doesn't really answer anything. That's kind of.
Well, let me see. I'm gonna keep on looking. If you want to deal with another question.
Well, I'm not seeing any. You're gonna have to ask them.
Well, okay. Well, they're in that. I'm looking at Basil's questions that he said.
Yeah, I don't have a copy of them though.
Pretty okay.
Unless you send them to my email account, I have to check.
No, it's in. There's a group messenger. Hold on. I don't know if you can see it. Hold on. Let me just. Are you in your messenger?
No, hold on. Well, we have a question in the chat. It's can you explain the schism between the old believers and the Russian Orthodox Church?
I think we covered this.
Yeah.
Good.
Pardon me?
Say it again. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, basically, it started in the 1650s and 60s. And during this time period, there was a lot of pressure on the Russian church, or at least Patriarch Nikon put this pressure to alter the Russian church service books. And the idea was that because there were differences between the usage of the Byzantine Rite in Russia and the usage of the Byzantine Rite in Constantinople, that obviously it was thought this meant the Russians had at some point in the centuries past corrupted the liturgical texts. For example, another point was the Russians have the custom of making the sign of the cross by taking their forefinger and the middle finger, extending them out, and then taking the thumb, the ring finger, and the little finger and pressing them together. And that was how they made the sign of the cross. Whereas the Greek world, and by extension the Serbs and others that were technically part of that Balkan Greek world, Orthodox world, would make the sign of the cross by having the thumb, the forefinger, the middle finger pressed together, and the ring finger and the little finger in the palm. And that was how they made the sign of the cross. So the Russians said, and many of the Russians refused to abandon this way. Now, this form of making the sign of the cross, as I understand, can actually be traced back, to like the 8th century or 7th century and much earlier. And it seems that when the missionaries that came from Constantinople, Bulgaria, the other areas that went into Russia, they were making the sign of the cross in this older way. And at some point in Constantinople, they changed from making the 2-finger sign of the cross to the 3-finger. There's a lot of speculation as to when it happened, probably beginning of the 12th and 13th century. I certainly know that the pre-schism Western way of making the sign of the cross was with 3 fingers. So some theorize that may have been that may have kind of imported itself into the East, whereas the Russians retained the older Eastern way. So that was one issue. The other issues, again, were like, what direction do you process at Pascha outside the church? Should it be clockwise or counterclockwise? Should there be 7 prosper or 5 prosper that are offered? Should there be 2 alleluias or 3 alleluias? Should you do a prostration here, a bow here? What should the vestment? Should the vestments be this exact shape or that exact shape? I think there are probably many other liturgical differences. Old believer services, I think, probably tended to be a little bit longer than the Greek services, the old Russian services did. Anyway, so the concept was that Patriarch Nikon wanted to conform the Russian church to the usages of. No, I haven't covered this. So he wanted to conform the Russian church to the usages of the Church of Constantinople. However, there was a lot of opposition to this in Russia. And the change was forced through, nevertheless, and it created a massive schism in Russian society. So much so that by the time of the revolution, about 1/4 of the Russian population was actually old believer. And so that's kind of there's probably some political dynamics in there about how cultures were changing over time, and there was westernization and all this other stuff.
Well,
Now,
it's worthy of note that I think it was like 1/3 of the old believers were of the merchant class.
yes, and remember, especially when you get to the time of Peter the Great, and and a little bit before that, even though he kind of came after the schism had already happened, that Peter the Great was importing a lot of like German and Dutch merchants and engineers into Russia. Now, though Peter the Great, as I recall, didn't heavily persecute the old believers until around 1720, and then he kind of got upset about them because I think he felt maybe if he could convince them to join the official Russian church, but they didn't. But now that's interesting. Now, so that's the basics of it. Most of the old believers accepted that the priesthood was still continuing. A portion of the old believers, maybe like 10%, became what we call priestless. That is, they believed God had punished the church by taking away the priesthood. But most of them accepted the priesthood existed. However, they believed the episcopate had ceased to exist. But this posed an interesting problem for the old believers, which was, how do you get priests then? Because if all the next generation of people consecrated by the Niconians using the new rite, if they're heretics, then how do you accept their ordinations? And so the old believer solution was that ordination by Niconian bishops or Greek bishops are graceless until those priests join the old believer group, and then they're accepted by an old believer priest by, I don't know, like laying on of hands, and he reads a prayer of absolution, which is weird and strange, and it's not orthodox. I mean, ultimately, I would argue, the old believers adopted an unorthodox ecclesiology by saying it was possible for priests to receive, even by economy, bishops. Priests. If you're claiming to be the only true church and you say there aren't any bishops in the world left, I think you're not the true church.
Yeah.
So and the fact old believers kind of did crazy stuff, like immolate themselves, burn themselves at the stake. Just because they seemingly were the most extreme didn't really mean they were correct about everything.
We covered that in the Orthodoxy of False Extreme.
Exactly. And, a lot of bad things were done to the old believers. It probably didn't help that the Russian government on a few occasions burned some people at the stake. That did not help the situation. Like when they burnt at the stake Archpriest Avacum, who was the leader of the old believers.
Yeah, they made him a martyr.
That made him a martyr, and that solidified the schism. I think they even executed one of there was one bishop who was going to consecrate bishops for the old believer, but they even burned him at the stake. And it was just one terrible decision after the other. And if they had listened to the witness of St. John Chrysostom, St. Martin of Tours, and other fathers, they would have simply not killed people. There would have been maybe they would have put them under disabilities, but better yet, to be honest, I think it would have been just preferable if they hadn't made this switch over to the new rite. Actually, a lot of the people who became old believers were actually asking if they could just be allowed to use the old rite. They wouldn't break from the official church. And Nikon and others kind of forced the issue. And it got to the point where in the 1780s and so, the Russian church said, we're going to allow the old rite to be used. And we're going to effectively remove the condemnation of the old rite. And at that point, something called the Edu Naviri, which was kind of like you might say the old believer unions or the of sorts under the Russian church, were formed. And it took off and it expanded continuously throughout the 19th century, and it got bigger and bigger. And it went from kind of an ad hoc measure that they were going to get rid of to something they were going to keep. So it's really a sad series of events. And the ROCOR took off, and the ROCOR made another statement back in like 1971, I believe, saying they were sorry for the events that led to the schism, and they had no problem with the old rite and such. So, but it doesn't. But as much sympathy we can have for old believers, it doesn't justify a lot of the crazy things and stuff they did.
Yeah,
So,
and a lot of them became heretics. So that's
yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, I think essentially, even if they weren't thinking about it, they were promoting a heretical ecclesiology.
some of them
Like,
became Uniates.
well, yeah, exactly. And this was the problem with the old believer spirit, I think. Why did you have old believers that became Uniates around 1920? You have the Russian Orthodox Old Rite Greek Catholic Church, because they were so obsessed with the old rite per se that
Didn't matter
that
who was
if
on.
the Pope was going to allow them to do it, they didn't care. So it became all about the rite and not about the faith. It became more about external usages over anything else.
Yep.
And that may have been and some people theorize that this may have been a problem in the missionization of Russia. This is not meant to be attacking the missionization, but that when they were converting mass swaths of hundreds of thousands of Slavic people, they taught them the basics of the gospel and the Christian teaching and baptized them and gave them a communion and all the rest. But that trying to inculcate orthodoxy firmly into a mass amount of illiterate pagan people was going to take, they were going to accept orthodoxy, but getting that spirit into them was going to take several generations. And some historians believe that what kind of happened, and this is not meant to attack the missionaries, that it became very formalistic in how they said, as long as you do these correct rites and you do this and do that, everything should be all right. It didn't mean that people didn't have faith, but it meant that if you keep on preaching it in that sense, the faith in kind of this formalistic sense, it will eventually have negative results. Because obviously, I don't think it's possible to explain the old believer schism like it just came out of nowhere. There had to be some sort of a problem going on in Russian society for people to go down that route and to be so obsessed with just the old rite that they would do crazy things like, say the priesthood had ceased to exist. You agree with me about Father Joseph?
Yeah, no, I agree.
I don't know exactly what it was. Historians can debate it, but there was probably now Metropolitan. I think St. Macarius of Moscow back in the 1550s, I think, had something called the Stoglov Synod, in which this was important.
Yeah.
And the Stoglov Synod actually condemned making the sign of the cross with 3 fingers. Of course, this created a massive problem because what about the rest of the Orthodox who made the sign of the cross with 3 fingers? And so the Russian monastery of Manathos actually said they would not accept these anathemas against the 3-finger cross back in 1557. And as far as I understand, Metropolitan Macarius kind of didn't press the issue. So the anathema essentially became kind of just an eternal Russian anathema against, 3-finger crosses and things like that.
Yeah, but now it became
a bigger issue when exactly. Now Vladimir Moss makes an interesting point that some of these people who are going to become old believers, like the pre-old believers, the pre-schismatic old believers, you might say, were just waiting. This was just an accident waiting to happen with the problems in the Russian church. That if a Nikon figure had come about like in 1620, something would have happened even if he hadn't been as harsh. But I'm not too certain if it would have been. I don't think it would have been as big if there hadn't been a massive state persecution and intervention. Because remember, when Patriarch Jeremias the Illustrious came to Moscow to formalize the tomos of the Patriarchate, he did the services and made the sign of the cross with 3 fingers, and no one really it was noted as interesting, but no one condemned the ecumenical patriarch for it. And when I think the patriarch of Jerusalem came to Moscow in 1620, and I think he consecrated the Patriarch of Moscow actually. He made the sign of the cross with 3 fingers, and he did various things according to the Greek usages, and it was thought as an interesting curiosity. But none of the priests were screaming for him to be condemned as a heretic. All right.
Yeah.
So they may have had crazy people there, but the vast majority of clergy who would later, would not have thought about becoming old believer, which happened with, like let's say a third of them or a fifth of them, if it hadn't been for a lot of these extremely harsh measures that then suddenly made people like Archpriest Avicum and others seem reasonable, like, oh, this must be really evil if they're persecuting us. So I know that's kind of the talk about the old believer schism is pretty complicated, and it gets into all kinds of different avenues. But it was something pretty terrible that happened in Russian society, and I think Solzhenitsyn was correct when he said Russian society never really recovered from it. That it was, that I don't think Solzhenitsyn agreed with him, but and the fact that the Russian church tried to promote the Edu Naviri, and it was successful. And that you had people like Metropolitan St. Philaret of Moscow in the 1850s preaching to the old believers that we have the same faith. When they would join, he would say, look, as long as you accept, that we can do our right and you can do yours, there's no problem. But even today, most of the old believers aren't like that. And to be honest, to say that if you make the sign of the cross with 3 fingers, this indicates an immediate apostasy, it is, I think, kind of a heresy of ritualism.
Yeah.
Because remember what Patriarch Saint Photius said. He said this in relation to the fact when he was asked about the differences of the Latin Church, which was at that time still Orthodox, and he said, and this is quoted in the 1895 encyclical of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, where he says that any custom or rite or usage which does not conflict with the dogmatic dogmas and canons of the ecumenical and local councils in the church is allowable if it comes from the fathers. And that should simply be just enough for everybody. That's my opinion. Okay, so Father. I
went through a few things on Father George Kolarowski on creation. While I can't find anything that explicitly says that he said Adam and Eve were real, he makes constant references to Adam. He constantly refers to the fall of Adam. He does refer to Christ as the last Adam. He quotes St. Maximus and a host of other fathers on a number of his essays, but I would assume that is enough to say that, but he did not, I guess, find occasion to have to spell out that Adam and Eve were real.
Yes. I mean, it could be buried in some of his writings, or we'd have to probably talk to people who knew him, and I don't know anybody who knew him. So.
Well, I think it's clear he probably did believe in Adam and Eve. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah, supposedly Florovsky was like kind of a much more conservative type figure, and even though I think he had been into kind of the ecumenical stuff early on, but supposedly he kind of moved away from some of that in his later life.
He has an essay. It's on script called "Creation and Creaturehood."
Yeah.
Which talks about it's interesting because what it talks about is if I am remembering correctly, it's talking about the basis of creation, and it talks about a number of the fathers on what that was about, and then further he's made a lot of references to creation. I don't have any doubt that he believes in it in terms of, as he even cites St. Basil to a large degree.
But I see Basil's questions. I probably have to do more research, but I get the impression from I have a vague sense in my memory through looking through the French edition of Metropolitan Macarius' Orthodox Dogmatic Theology that he addresses some of the German Protestant ideas, and he basically says they're not. I think he does deconstruct them as unacceptable and heretical. Because I can certainly tell you that in the Russian seminary system they weren't teaching any of that, as far as I understand, because I've seen a few translations in French and others of the textbooks they used in the pre-revolutionary Russian Church. I mean, even the Roman Catholic Church wasn't even teaching this higher biblical criticism into the like 40s and 50s.
Really, I thought it was with the 50s and 60s.
Well, I think what happened in the Roman Catholic Church, there were in fact these liberals that were believing it since the 20s, but they weren't publicly teaching this stuff.
Right.
So, I got a Wikipedia article open from the Russian Wikipedia, and I'm looking through it to see. Because generally, if you look on the Russian Wikipedia, if you go through Google Translate, they have like a little bit of emphasis on the Orthodox Church, obviously. Mm-hmm. But I'm not seeing anything here about this subject. You see, one of the problems you encounter is that a lot of like kind of modernists and modernistic type people, and some people who claim that they're traditionalists, will go into this tirade about fundamentalists with using the word without really knowing what it means.
Yeah.
And as I recall, the word fundamentalist originally meant what you believed it was like the 5 fundamentals.
There were I thought it was 11 fundamentals.
Well, there the 5 fundamentals, but then there were these 11 points of like the evangelical.
Right.
But a lot of them were like very basic stuff, like the divinity of Christ, the resurrection,
like God created the world.
Exactly.
But that's because Protestantism at the time had just gone so far off the deep end. I mean, this is when Unitarianism started getting bigger, and they
Well, remember what had happened in the late 19th century, because you have to understand what happened in Protestant to understand why this stuff is all coming into the so-called Orthodox system, seminaries or whatever. It's because in the mid and late 19th century, there was something called the modernist fundamentalist divide. And basically, it was all kind of spurred on by a lot of it ultimately, I think, by not just the Enlightenment, but by Darwinism.
Yeah.
That kind of new false theory and such. And then some of the German biblical criticism. I mean, to be honest, a lot of the German biblical criticism and stuff was not that much different than stuff that the Enlightenment deists were actually saying when they were attacking the Bible. But once that comes about, there are some groups of Protestants who kind of want to make a compromise and say, well, we can accept some of the modernism, but not all of it. But that's kind of a teetering, system where eventually you're going to accept everything. So by the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, you had a division in Protestantism between what was called the fundamentalism or modernism. Now, if you had gone back to the year 1700, all Protestants would still be classified as fundamentalists. Modernism was more the new thing and such. Although I think students of religious history in America will say that fundamentalist does have a little bit of a different meaning, because it kind of means you're a little bit more militant in how you say the same things as someone else might have said it 100 years ago, but in a different way. But once this gets into the seminary system, then everything is just going to collapse. Because initially what happens is they say, well, only the Old Testament we're going to criticize. But then if the Old Testament proves to be historically inaccurate and made up of kind of post facto interpolations, like, for example, the prophecy about Cyrus, the coming of Cyrus, King Cyrus, if that's written supposedly after Cyrus freed the Jews and let them come out of captivity, then what is prophecy to begin with? And if the Old Testament prophecies mean nothing, then what about their predictions of Christ? See, it all starts to unravel if you attack the authenticity of the historical narrative of the Old Testament. Then what reliability is there in the New Testament? So I'll try to find some more information, Basil, about exact articles that were written in by some Orthodox writers. And maybe I'll put together some quotes and things in a file. I'll link it in the description tomorrow.
No, I'm looking at the comments. I guess you already talked about Solzhenitsyn and the schism with the old believers. Yeah,
we addressed that. Yes.
Yeah, I don't because Solzhenitsyn also thought that the true Orthodox Church in Russia didn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. Solzhenitsyn said, "I never once met somebody in the catacomb." Yeah. And one of the catacomb bishops wrote a letter and said, we didn't exactly go out of our way to identify ourselves in the camps.
Exactly. It was kind of ridiculous.
And now just one more point. Before people start listening to the old believers, like the ones, there are two old believer groups that have bishops now, and they got their bishops in 1840 and then in 1920 respectively.
Right.
Before we start listening to them as supposedly the purest of all the pure, remember, the old believers were allowed to publicly operate in the Soviet Union from the 1940s until 1990.
Yep.
No religious group was allowed to publicly operate in the Soviet Union unless they were controlled. So here's something interesting. The Russian Orthodox Catacomb Church, the supposedly evil Nikonians and corrupt ones, did not accept this control, while the old believers accepted it. Well, all the while they resisted the supposed czarist control. Yep. And you know the reason why? Because the Soviets didn't care if they used these rituals as long as they did whatever the Soviet government said. It was ultimately what it came down, and that's the problem with the old believers. It came down, as long as you let us use this right, we don't really care.
It's the Pope or the communists.
Exactly.
You're good.
And so this is why there may be nice old believers, and I'm sure there were, and I think there were old believers who did resist it, but the vast majority did not.
I think that a lot of the reason we respect the old believers, I'm going to be honest, is because the Russian church is the biggest church in the world, and we tend to see the old believers as some ancient branch of the Russian church, when in reality it was a schism, and a lot of them were heretics, and frankly shouldn't be given the respect that they think.
So, and there was the attempt by the Roe Corps in the 70s to kind of like bring some of the old believer back into orthodoxy. And it happened with there was a parish in Erie, Pennsylvania, but in a lot of these other places, what happened? There was one case, I believe, in which I can't remember the name of there was one of the Rocor archbishops. He was the archbishop up in Bishop Nectari up in Seattle, and he met with them, and he was always asking, and they were always complaining like how horrible you treated us, and they always were like they were like basically acting like victims all the time.
Yeah.
And so Nectari got on his hands and feet and he cried. He says, "I'm so sorry. My ancestors did these things. Please forgive me." And they did not know how to react because they were not expecting that. And they said, "Well, you're a good man, but we've done this so long we can't stop."
No, that's sad, but it's true.
My point is that so you have someone like a holy bishop like Bishop Nectari saying, "Look, you can use all your rights. That's no problem. I'm sorry that the Russian czars were mean and did these terrible things. We can end this all now. We don't want to run you. We don't want to control you, but we just want you to be part of us in the fullness of orthodoxy." And they would admit that, yeah, it would be a good idea, but almost it's like the schism had taken a life of its own where it couldn't be repaired.
Yep.
And even they comment in articles that even among the old believers, schisms were happening all the time because one group would say, because what would happen is two old believer communities, elders would meet on some specific day, on some, let's say, unimportant feast that happened to fall on, that happened to be commemorated on that Sunday. And one would discover that, how the verb, what the verb used in some hymn was slightly different, was like a different form of the verb in another hymn or something like that. And they would say that's not correct. And they get in a big fight, and then a schism would erupt over, let's say, just the spelling of a letter or how the orthography was written over a hymn. So, if you're dealing with that kind of stuff, you're dealing with people who, yes, they have all this ancient formalism preserved from pre-Niconian Russia, but what has that formalism led them to? Where they're going to start condemning people like St. Seraphimus Seraph as evil because, I don't know why, because he didn't make the sign of the cross with two fingers. So I can't really get this great feeling of admiration for the old believers, because ultimately a lot of it comes down to people saying, look how the old believers do 4.5 or 5 hour all night vigils, but is it just the lengths of service? Is that supposed to determine everything? I mean, that's kind of the formalism I think some people feel attached to, and it can lead to a dangerous decision, like old believers becoming unions.
Yeah.
Okay, so Atomic Lead says, returning to the issue of angels and corporeality, do the Orthodox permit the idea of a spiritual matter of which the angels are made? I read the Nicaea 2 quote, John of Thessalonica, in favor of this. I'd have to see the quote. You'd have to point it out. So, if you can point it out.
I don't doubt the possibility. I mean, it's just, we don't know what angels are made of.
Angels are obviously made of created matter.
Right.
Created matter.
What kind of matter is the question? Are they? They're not made out of like typical gas, liquid, or.
Oh yeah, whatever it is, it's created. That's all.
Yeah.
That's.
Oh yeah, we know that.
Yeah.
So that to answer your question, yeah, some kind of spiritual matter, but we don't know what it is.
Yes.
Okay,
so Basil says he did really dislike allegorizing, Florovsky, that is. Okay, Brandon Thorpe says doing a big think right now all of a sudden. Okay, let's look at the other.
Helpful.
Yeah.
If you have more questions, let us know. Hope we haven't totally turned you off to orthodoxy.
Let's look at the other question. So we answered the Imislavy question. Is Imislavy related to Hegelianism?
I answered that. No, don't give them that much credit. Do not. They don't.
Imislavy was actually, just so I understand, Imislavy was actually started by Hilarion, the monk Hilarion.
Right.
And what had happened was that there was a monk named Hilarion. I think he was originally a Hieromonk monk before he was deposed. Mm-hmm. And he was going around to all the different ascetics in the Caucasus Mountains, and they were describing how they saw the uncreated light.
Yeah.
And he was trying to figure out, what does this mean? And so he said, well, they're saying the Jesus prayer when the uncreated light is manifested. And therefore, he on his own reasoned, and correct me if I'm wrong here.
No, I think you're right so far.
He thought, well, the uncreated light and the name of Jesus are synonymous.
Well, the argument that I've heard is, that he learned it from someone else, but the idea is that this heresy found a perfect place to go. And what I mean by that is, by associating the name of Jesus with the direct presence of Jesus, people who say the Jesus prayer all day long can be tempted by pride. It was a perfect temptation for them. It's
But we should still say the Jesus prayer
no,
constantly.
no, we should, but we don't. We shouldn't believe we're calling down Jesus because we're saying the Jesus prayer. That's a sin.
And remember in the book of Acts how you had those Jewish exorcists who were exorcising someone.
Sons
Said
of Sheba or something. Yeah,
they were saying, "We command you, the demon, in the name of the Jesus whom Paul preaches."
right.
And the demon turned and said, "Jesus I know and Paul I know, but who are you?" And the demon jumped. The possessed guy jumped up and grabbed him and chased him out of the way.
Yeah.
So just using the name Jesus, that which is the holy name of our Lord, incarnate Lord, is itself not going to save you if it's not done with true faith.
Yeah, otherwise Jesus would be apparent in every lost football game.
Because look, the name Joshua, it was a common name in Jewish life at the time. So it's who it's representing is important. Okay, so question 6 is, how should one draw his family members into the Orthodox Church in broad principle terms? Should one be direct and bold with a spirit of humility, or is it better to only speak of such things when family brings it up? I suppose the question is, how is one to relate to those outside of the church who do not approach seeking answers? Well, how would you answer that, Father Joseph?
I like question 8 better, but anyway, looking at number 6, how would one draw his family members into the Orthodox Church? As somebody who has pretty poor experience in bringing family members into the Orthodox Church, I can tell you what not to do. There are a few things I would not suggest. I would honestly a few things that I can suggest are the things that I haven't done in my life, and some of those involve not being terribly confrontational, but always being principled. Always saying your prayers, but not being a jerk about it. Being polite and encouraging to people who want to go to the heretical church, but refusing to go with them politely. Offering to take them to yours. I mean, the point is, it's very simple. There are certain things that, where obedience would become a risk. If you have become Orthodox, your mother does not fast, and she serves you non-fasting food. It becomes a sin to be disobedient if you're not an adult. The point is, you are supposed to live your best life as a Christian, as a person, as God would want you to, and that example will manifest itself to your family. Anything else?
Now, remember, even as I recall, Father Seraphim Rose, he was never able. Correct me if I'm wrong. He was never able to convert his mother to Orthodoxy, and she died in the Methodist Church. So you can have a figure like Father Seraphim Rose, who is, I believe, a holy man and a well-learned man, but there's only so much you can do. You can't blame somebody saying that, well, he didn't convert his mother or his sister, so therefore, you must be doing something wrong. People have a free will of their own.
Ultimately. Yeah, and ultimately, Poemen has no sons. The
say that again.
Poemen has no sons.
What does that mean?
It's a reference to Abba Poemen, when his I believe it was a cousin of his. Her son, basically a judge wanted to have a conference with Abba Poemen, who was very well known. So what he did is he found that
Abba Poemen,
and okay. So he took his nephew, and basically locked him up and told the mother, if I don't meet with Abba Poemen, I'm not letting your son go. At which point she came and she begged at Abba Poemen's cell to let him go, and he simply let out a note that said Poemen hath no sons. So she gave the note to the judge. The judge realized he wasn't going to come out and speak to him, and he let out another note saying that let the judge judge according to fairness, and if he's being fair, let him, and if he's done no wrong, let him go. And so the judge let him go, obviously not getting the conference that he wanted. There's only so much you can do, but you still have to try. It's especially important it's much more important as a parent than it is as a kid. And this is one of those things where I hate to say this, but if you're properly focused, you're more focused on the conversion of your kids than you are on your parents, because the truth of the matter is it's a lot harder. They raised you, so they're going to listen to you a lot less than you'd like them to. That's what I got on that.
Okay, why don't you read the next question, Father, that Basil sent?
How should one think of non-Orthodox who have passed away, especially when they're within one's family? This isn't so much of a question of salvation, though it undergirds it, but how to direct itself towards them in prayer.
There's actually on Orthodox Info. There's an article about this. How to pray? How should we pray for the departed, not departed, non-Orthodox? And let me pull that up real quick. Praying for the non-Orthodox. Okay, praying for the reposed non-Orthodox, and it quotes some of the Russian elders. Obviously, you cannot have a public service. All right, but that's out of the question. But the question is, what about private prayer? And here I think we give an example. Okay, so I'm looking here. I'm going to put the article in the chat so people can look at it if they want to look at it at the same time I'm doing it. Here's the article. It's in the chat right there. Okay, so let me see here. Pray for the reposed, the burial, praying for on the burial. There was, I cannot find it now. Okay, so burial. As I recall, there was somewhere on one of the Orthodox Info articles, an article where it talks about a Russian elder, and a man came to the Russian elder. I think maybe it was Elder Macarius of Optina, and or Elder Ambrose of Optina, and he said something like, "My father was non-Orthodox and he died. What should I do?" And he said, "Simply say, O Lord, in your mercy, if you can't have mercy on so and so." And that was basically his suggestion. Okay,
definitely worth a link to. If we put a link to that,
I think I put a link. Didn't I just put a link in the?
Okay, good.
Now there is something called the Akathist to Saint, the Canon to Saint Verus, which actually I think it may have like a Slavonic origination. I'm not sure it has a Greek original. It may have, which actually is a canon that's privately prayed for non-Orthodox.
Oh, okay.
That does exist, and I'd have to find that somewhere. But I do have a copy of my computer, and I think you probably can. You see the canon, Saint Verus, non-Orthodox. I think it's canon of supplication. Yeah, canon of supplication to the Holy Martyr Verus. Here I post a link to it. It's a PDF right here, which addresses some of this stuff.
Okay, so there's something you can say for your reposed family.
Yes. Now, of course, ultimately, only God can determine these things, but I think some of the elders were willing to say that, simply saying, "Oh Lord, if you can't have mercy, have mercy." That there's nothing really wrong with saying that. So, and leave the rest up to God ultimately.
Now, there's a question here. We're getting towards the last part of the hour here, and it's more of an apology.
Okay, let's go a little bit over since we weren't here yesterday.
Huh? Well, okay, but all right. Well, this one's an apologetics-based question. It says, "Why does the debacle of the Ephesus Robber Council not demonstrate that papal recognition is necessary for a council to be ecumenical?"
Why does the debacle of the Ephesus
Robber Council?
Oh, the Latrocinium.
Well, yeah, the Latrocinium. Well, hold on. I'm gonna just to get right to it. Okay, when we take a look at what happened at the Latrocinium, I'm gonna just read the part from the wiki that's relevant. The evidence given at the Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon contradicts the accounts in the acts of the final scene of the session. It was reported that the secretaries of the bishops had been violently prevented from taking notes, and that it was declared that both Barsumas and Dioscorus struck Flavian. It was further reported that many bishops threw themselves on their knees to beg Dioscorus for mercy for Flavian and also for Alexandrine Parabolani, that some signed a blank paper and others did not sign at all. All the names being filled in afterwards of all who were actually present. To the papal legate Hilarius uttered a single word in Latin contradicitur, annulling the sentence in Leo's name. That part, it's not necessarily in Leo's name, or well, it could be, he was a legate. But he escaped with difficulty. It was said Dioscorus had previously gathered 1,000 monks, telling them to wait outside the church during the council to come when he called them. When Dioscorus began to read the sentence of condemnation against Flavian and Eusebius, some bishops went up to Dioscorus asking him not to. Dioscorus called the guard. Guards and the 1,000 monks who were waiting outside with some soldiers came in and charged at Flavian and his followers. Flavian ran to the altar and grabbed hold of it for his life. The soldiers forcefully took him from the altar, beating him, kicking him, and then whipping him. Flavian was deported into exile and died a few days later in Lydia. His body was it was buried in obscurity. Now, if you're wondering why I'm mentioning this, it's very simple. No amount of papal sanction or not papal sanction would have stopped the events at the Robber Council of Ephesus from happening. There was no concept.
The legates of the Pope were already there to begin with.
Yes, and they almost died. So that didn't work out very well for them. Clearly, they weren't like contradicitor, and everyone bowed down to them. They were like, "No, let's kill him." So the point is, no. This whole concept. There was no hidden papal authority that was going on. What was going on at the Robber Council of Ephesus was a travesty of justice and probably a murder. The point is, no papal sanction or non-papal sanction would have made a difference. What makes a difference is the faith of orthodoxy being preserved at the council, and what the Robber Council was nothing more than a violent attempt to force heresy upon the people. I hope that answers your question, Atomic Lead. And Father, you have another question.
Okay. The next question is, how should a layman study the canons? When I posted the rudder, some friends reacted rather harshly, but I am not a bishop, so it is not my concern.
Get new friends.
This seemed rather, what, pardon me?
I said, get new friends.
Now, I think there are some local canons you will find, like, that aren't in the rudder, that do say things like, laymen should not concern themselves with the canonical the canonical trial procedures of people being tried.
Yeah, and that's fine.
And that makes sense. I mean, if you're having a trial and a deacon or a priest is being tried, it may not be the best interest of a layman to say, well, tell us, I mean, basically being a busybody about what's happening in the trial.
Yeah, unless you're planning to become a canon lawyer, there's really no value to it.
Yeah, and people forget, and throughout the history of Byzantium, most of the canonists were not clergy. As I recall, they were actually laymen who studied the canons. Like, for example, Theodore Balsamon, I believe, originally was a secular judge and also a canon lawyer who later took monastic vows and became a priest and then later a bishop. And so this repeats over and over again. And even in the Russian and Greek church, most of the a lot of the canonical experts were simply lay professors of theology or lay professors of canon law. So, should a layman study the canons? Sure. I think, but if you study the canons, I think you should study them with the mind of the church, which is, in this case, means basically reading them in the context, one, that they were written, two, with all the available commentaries you can get, three, comparing, if it comes across a controversial canon or a controversial statement, you need to look at all the different possible commentaries and all the possible examples in church history where this canon was enforced and how it was enforced. All right? For example, there are canons that deal with that you should not ordain a man a priest below the age of 30. All right, but I can tell you, as a matter of fact, that canon has more often than not, or at least let's say like 20% of the time, has not been followed to the letter. Yeah.
To be fair, in the canons, there are notes about the fact that there were even exceptions to the canon.
Yeah, for example, when Saint Boniface was in Germany. And he was missionizing the northern areas of Germany. He was coming across the problem where he had people who were deacons, who were 25 and 26, but he had not enough priests. So maybe a deacon can give somebody communion or baptize somebody in extremis, but they can't give chrismation, they can't give confession, they can't celebrate mass, they can't do all these other things. And so Saint Boniface wrote to Saint Zacharias of Rome. And he said, what about this? Is it permissible, do you think, that I could ordain somebody, a priest, who's under the age of 30? And St. Zachary said, look, in normal operations, when the church is operating in a normal sense, 30 is the right age. But in a missionary circumstance, if the choice is between having no priest there or making a deacon who is 26 or 27 a priest, it is acceptable according to the customs of the fathers, he says, St. Zachary, to make such a man a priest. Even though it's not in strict accordance with the letter of the canon does allow, you might say, economy, we can say on this. Yeah. And the same thing you saw, even you look in 19th century Russia and Greece, when they were ordaining people priests, and they were like 25 and 24, 23 and such. And in the case of Russia, you'd think they'd been much more established. But even in 19th century Russia, you had cases where there were villages that didn't see a priest except maybe once or twice a year. especially they were continuing. So they had to make people priests who are like, I think like Saint Innocent or Saint I think Saint Innocent or Saint Philaret were made priests when they were like 23 or 24 and such. And that was not just because they were especially holy; it was because they had to do it. But that's an example of someone, and another because someone might say, "Well, you've been ordained below." Someone was ordained a priest at the age of 26 or deacon at the age of 24. Therefore, that's contrary to the canon. Therefore, they should be deposed. Therefore, they were never really ordained to begin with, and therefore their ordination is invalid. And this comes with the whole Simoniac ordination question that Saint Nicodemus talks about in the Pedalion, where there are canons that say if somebody pays for ordination, that is simony, they are to be deposed.
Well, Saint Innocent was actually made a deacon at 20.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so my point was anyway. So my point is how do we square that? Now, Saint Nicodemus says the following. Saint Nicodemus says in regards to, let's say, the Simoniac ordinations, that yes, those people should be deposed, but they are not automatically deposed. A deposition actually has to be enforced. So when you read a canon I'm giving this as an example of why you have to be careful when you study the canons. When a canon has an order given in the third person, according to St. Nicodemus, it's giving it as, let this be done. It has to be enforced. There's really only one reason that one kind of canon that talks about an ipso facto provision, or a few canons, but really one, which is Canon 15 of the First Second Council of 861. And it says, if your bishop, your metropolitan, your patriarch preaches heresy condemned by the Holy Fathers or the councils, you are to immediately separate from him. It says, because he's a false bishop, and even if you don't have to wait for a council or a judgment on him to be tried, you just separate from him if he preaches bareheaded open heresy publicly. But for everything else, you don't have the right to separate. So my point is that you have to study the
there's
canon.
Almost no canons that talk about separation to begin with. As a matter of fact, it's condemned more often than it's allowed.
Exactly, and that's why Canon 15. The reason Canon 15 was passed was they wanted to narrow this down to the most important things, so people didn't just get upset about their bishop for, I don't know, ordaining somebody who they didn't like as priest, or ordaining his cousin.
That's covered in the canons.
Pardon me?
That's covered in the canon.
Yeah, but my point is that people would say, oh, the bishop has ordained all these people against the canons, therefore I'm going to stop commemorating him. Well, that is not a reason to stop commemorating the bishop. The only reason you can stop commemoration of the bishop is, one, if he's a heretic, and two, if you're claiming he's not the real bishop to begin with. Like if somebody says, there's a disputed election of a patriarch and no one's really sure who was the true patriarch and there are two competitor patriarchs. That's a question of that's a different question. That's a question of who is the actual patriarch, as opposed to not commemorating the patriarch.
And usually people at the lower levels are not found guilty regardless of which side they choose.
Yes. So you study the rudder. I think a lot of times people say don't study it because there are a lot of clergy are afraid of.
There's a lot of people who are afraid of Orthodox doing apologetics too.
Exactly. And
what it is frankly, there is a grouping in modern Orthodoxy that don't want Orthodox to know stuff. If we sound like, I hate to say this, but if we sound like ridiculous brutes, then we're doing our job. The simple reality is Orthodoxy has an answer, and some people may not like the answer. I was only kidding when I said, by the way, Basil, get new friends. But honestly, if your friends are going to judge you for that, you got to tell them, we'll do coffee or something. We'll have our thing.
Yes, you should study the rudder and the canons, but do it again in the context in which they were written. Read the commentaries and read the patristic examples of how they're followed.
Don't start reading them and going, aha. If anything, take any aha to your priest. Shoot, even take it to, people throw canons at us all the time. But the point is, don't make conclusions based on the canons. The canons have a lot more to teach us than just what to do in a situation. They also educate us on the practice of the church. And we should keep that in mind, that a lot of that stuff doesn't apply to us. It doesn't apply to us even as lower. It doesn't apply to us as lower to middle clergy. It doesn't apply to us as laymen.
Okay, I'm confused. What doesn't apply to us?
Well, a lot of stuff, like, for example, like the ownership of the church goods if you're the bishop. You're not the bishop.
Oh, you're right. Okay, I see.
So we're not bishops. How to receive in communicants who have fallen to paganism. That's good for you. But that doesn't help me. Do you get what I'm saying, though? That a lot of the canons have nothing to do with lay people.
Yeah, but I still think there's a point in which a layperson who seriously studies the canonical literature does have some sort of a right, if they see that the clergy flagrantly disregarding them, to say, look, this is something we have to correct.
Well, yeah, but that's clergy correcting clergy. That's also.
No, I'm saying even the laity, I think, have some sort of right.
Yeah,
if, for example,
recourse to the.
What I mean is this: if a layman sees, for example, mass simony happening,
yeah,
I think they have to say something.
Oh yeah, and they have a right to, and I think that'll help them, reveal a lot of things.
But there's a difference between having to make a stand because of mass problems and being a busybody in everybody's business.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a balance.
I think this is going to be the last question. I hope that helps, Basil. And then we're going to shut off here. Brandon Thorpe asks, I heard a theory about turn thy cheek command. It's turn the other cheek. In those times, to strike someone across the face was considered a challenge to one's honor, not necessarily an assault. I hate to say this, but I think that's really more of a fantasized view of the Middle Ages, where it's like, I challenge you to a duel, slap, slap. In reality, if you hit someone in the face throughout most of history, it was not only considered an assault, it was considered an open invitation to hit back.
Well, what's if you struck someone in the face, was...
There was never a point in history where it was like, I gently slap you across the face to challenge your authority. That never happened. That was always, there was no challenge to a duel, or I think that's from TV shows about the Middle Ages and fantasy dueling. In reality, you hit someone in the face, expect the consequences. But the point is, the Christian is supposed to take the shot in the face unless it's at war, in which case they're kind of already taking the shot in the face for the other people who aren't fighting. And all the other
of course, that's what Saint and this is an important point to bring up.
Saint
yes. Okay. So Saint Kirill Saint Kirill Methodius, who oftentimes he was called Constantine the philosopher, had a debate with Muslims, and in the debate, the Muslims said, "Well, if you claim to be following the Gospels, Christ in your Gospel said, turn the other cheek and don't resist evil when your enemies attack you." And Saint Photius says, not Saint Photius, but Saint Kirill says the following. He says, as you say, O friend, but if Christ... Okay, I'm sorry. So the Muslims ask Saint Kirill, and they say, but if Christ is your God, why do you not do as he commands? For in the gospel is written, pray for your enemies, do good to them that hate you and persecute you, and to them that smite you turn your cheek. You are not like that, but on the contrary, you sharpen weapons against those who treat you in such a manner. In answer to this, the philosopher, that is, St. Kirill, said, if the law contains two precepts, who appears to fulfill the law? He who keeps one precept or both? The Muslims answered, obviously, he who keeps both. St. Kirill then said, God said, pray for them which despitefully use you. And he also said, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. We do this for the sake of friends, lest their souls be captured together with their bodies. So we bear personal insults. But when it comes to attacks on the Christian commonwealth to the state,
or your family,
and a family, this is treated as a different matter. And in fact, there's Saint Philaret, the Metropolitan Saint Philaret of Moscow, who I think reposed in 1870. There's a famous quote. He's oftentimes, we often see, and he says something like, "You fight the enemies of the fatherland in war, but you forgive your personal enemies." I can't quite remember how he said it. That as you hate them only in the sense of they're your enemies in a battlefield, but you should fight them in almost in a dispassionate sense. I guess I'm not quite getting the quote correct, but as much as that's even possible. So the pacifist kind of confuses these two and says that the commandments of the Lord preclude any military defensive action. But this is not true. Our Lord, when he went to the centurions, when he answered the servant of the centurion who was sent to him, he didn't say, well, when you go back to your master, also tell him he has to give up his job as a commander of troops. And remember, St. Paul was actually taken into custody and actually gave himself into custody of Roman centurions. But by doing that, by surrendering himself to the centurions, didn't he realize that he was going to, by asking their protection and having people say, "Oh, there's someone going to come and assassinate St. Paul," etc. He was relying on the state to protect him. And St. Paul again brings that point up in Romans 13, that the magistrate of the state has the power to, in fact, kill people if they sufficiently transgress the law. And of course, there was one of the questions asked in the war room, and this is all very generalistic. So if I make any mistakes, I'm sorry here.
Huh?
About the supposedly pacifistic, absolute pacifistic statements of the pre-Nicene fathers against joining the military. This is contradicted, one, by the fact that there were, in fact, Christian soldiers in the military, like St. Maurice of the Theban Legion. He was a commander. Secondly, a lot of the opposition existed because in the Roman military, it was very difficult to avoid offering sacrifice to the pagan deities.
Father, you do realize that an episode on the military aspects of Christianity and the answer to the question of the illusion of pacifism in modern Christianity, that could take a whole episode.
Yes, I know. But I'm just saying is that a lot of this is illusory.
So let's talk about it tomorrow. Let's make that the episode.
All right. We have a lot of saints, great saints we can talk about and such.
St. George. Yeah, there's all the soldier saints of Orthodoxy.
Yeah, we can even bring up the monk saints who were involved in battles.
Yeah, hey.
So.
All right. So we're going to cut it short today. We're going to do, it's not short. It's technically 10 minutes over. But the point is we're going to do this again tomorrow, and it's 4 days a week. So from here on in.
All right.
All right. So again, this is Deacon Joseph.
This is Hiram Akinik.
Have a good night, all. Benedicite.
Benedicite.